Good morning, Dad.
Anyone's in the mood of making a round trip to Detroit? Let me know. Okay. Good morning. We are in the middle of chapter 41. I believe we are on page 609. Is that correct?
I think
That's
so.
what I have.
Yeah.
Okay. Excuse me. So we're in the middle of discussing fear. And last week we tried to separate between fear and no, between well, yes, but fear and obedience. Right. So although usually fear leads, the result of fear is obedience, and perhaps the easiest and most effective way of being obedient is by developing a fear. However, they can be separated, and they are two separate things. Now the Alter Rebbe is going to take this a step further. In other words, the Alter Rebbe started chapter 41 by saying that in order that a person needs two wings, love and fear. But the foundation, the first thing is fear. Why fear? Because that leads to obedience. We know that you can have obedience without fear. Okay, fine. But still work on fear because that's a better way of getting to obedience. What if you have obedience without the emotion of fear? Excuse me. Alter Rebbe is going to tell us by having obedience, you thought about fear. You didn't create an emotion of fear. You don't even have a fear in your head, but it led to obedience. You have obedience. That is, in other words, you have the effect of fear. That is considered having fear. In other words, this is not an intellectual emotion. This is pure intellect. Pure intellect has led you to be obedient. You didn't give birth to any emotion. But because it gave birth to the effect of the emotion, to obedience, it's as if you have obedience. It's as if you have fear. And therefore, it's considered a service of God, serving God. And therefore, it's as if you're flapping one of your wings. Okay? The Alter Rebbe uses for this, yeah.
Where does awe fit in? It's fear.
Again, later as the chapters go on, we're going to develop different levels in fear. But now we're talking about a basic level where you have the meditation at the beginning of the chapter of how great God is, how small and insignificant seemingly I am, and the fact that this great God wants me. That's more than just awesome. It's frightening because God is so powerful, God is so great, and he's looking at me. He's paying attention to what I'm doing.
So we're starting at the highest level.
No,
fear is the lowest.
Fear is, well, this type of fear is the most basic. There is a fear that's actual fear that's the greatest. We'll get to that again in time. Right now, it's just a general concept. You can use awe and fear interchangeably, but sometimes they are distinctive. The Alter Rebbe is going to invoke a story in the Talmud that we've actually discussed many times throughout the years. So you may have heard it before. The story of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was the leader of the Jewish people during the time of the destruction of the Second Temple. And we just recently mentioned this episode, I don't think last week, where he was laying on his deathbed and he lamented to his students. He was not crying, but he was lamenting. He doesn't know which way he's going, to heaven or hell. We've discussed that part of the story many times. How could it be that someone that great, who saved Judaism after the destruction, because he got the Romans to spare the Sanhedrin and Yavna, how could it be that he didn't know if he was going to heaven or hell? Okay. But then after this story, his students asked him to give them a blessing before he goes. He was on his deathbed. So he said, Yehi Ratzon, should be God's will, that you should feel the fear of heaven like you feel the fear of humans. So which fear is greater, the fear of heaven or the fear of humans? Excuse me. In other words, if his prayer is his blessing is, your fear of heaven should be as great as your fear of humans. Which one's greater? Which one's more natural? Which one?
Humans.
Humans. And he's saying, hopefully you'll have fear of heaven like you have fear of humans. So his students immediately reacted, that's it. That's the whole blessing. That's your whole wish for us. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said yes. Why? Because when a person sins, in other words, when a person wants to sin, what does he do as a preparation for sin? Whatever it is, any type of sin. A person that knows this thing is wrong, doesn't usually get, but decides he wants to do it. What's the first thing he's going to do before he goes to do the sin? Okay, very good. So in other words, he's going to he decided he's doing it. What's practically the first thing he's going to do physically to make sure before he on the way to go do the sin? What does that mean? I'm sorry?
Make sure he's safe. It depends on what he's doing. It could be making sure he's safe from the shadows, putting on some sort of protection.
Okay, depending on what type of sin he's committing. Okay, if he's committing, but there's a universal. I don't know. He's going to do something silly. He's not committing murder. He's not committing adultery. He's not committing a grave sin, idolatry. Something small. He wants to. He's a religious kosher eating Jew, and he wants to eat a cheeseburger. What's he going to do? The first thing before he's going to make sure no one's looking. He's going to make sure he goes away to a faraway place or he's in hiding. No one's looking. Why?
Did that before he killed the Egyptian.
Exactly. And anytime when I say sin, by the way, you can translate that to anything. You're in a relationship, you're a child of parents, and you want to do something you're not supposed to do. What's the first thing you're going to do? You're going to make sure no one's looking. You're not going to do it when people are looking, right? So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says the first thing a person wants to do, the first thing a person does when he comes to sin is he thinks, how can I make sure no one sees me? Yeah, but God sees you.
Yeah.
So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's blessing to them was that the fear of heaven should be as tangible, as immediate as the fear of humans. Let's take this apart for a second, getting sort of not exactly to what Jay was saying, but along those lines. Why does the person not want anyone to see? Is it fear? Well, a child who's doing something that his parents don't want, that might be fear. He doesn't want his parents to reaction. A spouse may be fearful of what their spouse or what their significant other may think. Okay, but the average person,
He's fear of the consequences.
really?
You get caught.
Let's say there's a child there, a young child. You still don't want to do it in front of them, right?
Right.
But what are you afraid of?
Not in that case.
There's no fear.
You just don't want them to see it.
So why does Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai call this fear? He calls it mora. Mora means fear, not mora like a teacher. Mora with an aleph, it means fear. Yira comes from the same root as yira. So the Rebbe proves from this that although it's called fear, we have to separate between the emotion of fear and the result of fear. In other words, not separate, but we have to identify that there are two elements to fear. There's the emotion and there's the result. And the result of fear is also called fear. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is identifying that when a person says, oh, I better make sure no one's looking, he identifies that as fear, even if there is no fear involved. If I'm in the middle of Timbuktu and I, God forbid, want to eat something non-kosher, do I have anyone to be afraid of? But why wouldn't I want anyone to see me? There's a certain inner shame to be seen, but there's no fear of anyone. I'm not scared of anyone. So you see, so the Alter Rebbe is breaking apart fear into two, that there's the emotion and there's the result. And if you have the result, let's see this inside in the words of the Alter Rebbe here on page 609, in the middle of chapter 41. Furthermore, as a matter of fact, excuse me, he not only fulfills the obligation of service. In other words, we're talking about someone who didn't create the emotion of fear. He just created the obedience based on the meditation of fear, but he didn't create the emotion. So as a matter of fact, he not only fulfills the obligation of service, he also fulfills the commandment of fearing God by introducing the fear into his thought, by thinking about it and seeking to arouse it. Because he meditated on it, even though it gave birth to no actual emotion, but it had a result. The result was obedience. He didn't commit the sin. That result is the result of fear, even though there was no identifiable fear. For at this hour and moment, at any rate, there rests upon him the fear of heaven, at least like the one's fear in the presence of an ordinary mortal, even not a king, who is watching him. In other words, even someone you're not going to get any consequences because of. But you still don't want to be seen by him. Why? When he would refrain from doing anything unseemly in the other's eyes, even though there's no fear. This, even the simple expression of fear, is termed fear. As Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said to his disciples, may it be God's will that the fear of heaven be upon you like the fear of a human being. In other words, and that's why I connected it to what Jay said. Jay wanted to know where awe comes in. Any emotion or any result that can be bundled together with fear, and awe really is bundled together with fear, is considered fear. What happens when you're in awe of someone? Why do you suddenly behave appropriately? Because you're scared to look like a fool, or you're scared to disappoint them, or you're fearful of how they may view you after seeing you do something so childish. Yeah. So that's fear, even though the emotion you're identifying with is awe, but the result is a result of fear, even though you're not trembling. He responded, what did Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai respond to his students? That the proof that this is indeed a true form of fear is as follows. For you know that when a person commits a sin, he says to himself, may no one see me. So in other words, that's fear, because Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai identifies that as fear of heaven. This isn't perhaps a very high level of fear. Such fear, however, is termed yira tata'a, which means lower level fear. And yirat chet, fear of sin, which precedes wisdom. In other words, it is only a lower level of fear, a fear of transgressing rather than a fear of God himself. While the higher fear is shamefaced fear. In other words, the state of being abashed and overawed in God's presence. That's a higher level of fear. That's a fear that comes out of meditating how great God is. For there are two kinds of fear, the lower level of fear, which leads to the performance of Torah mitzvahs, in other words, obedience, and the higher level of fear, which results from the proper performance of Torah and mitzvahs. Almost like a fear that's underneath understanding and a fear that is above understanding. A fear that precedes the performance of Torah and mitzvahs. The more, right, there's a fear of, when you start dating someone, your fear of disappointing them is very different than after 30 years of marriage, right? The fear at the start is your fear, you're scared of ruining it. The fear at the end is you're scared of letting them down. Yeah, they tell there's a whole bunch of kids like puppet shows that I grew up with about the rabbi that was once traveling with a non-Jewish coach or a wagon driver, and in the middle he's traveling and he sees some unprotected orchard and he wants to collect a basket of fruit. And as he's going to collect the fruit, the rabbi screams, "Hey, someone's watching!" So he comes running back to the wagon and he looks around. He doesn't see anyone. He goes back. So apparently the guy left. He goes back, and after a few times he realized no one's really watching. So he asked the rabbi, "What do you mean someone's watching?" He's like, "What do you mean God's watching?" But if he would have said God's watching, he wouldn't have left. He said someone's watching, suddenly he runs away. Okay. So now we know why the Alter Rebbe says that the first thing we need is fear. And again, fear doesn't mean what we thought it meant. Fear means anything that leads to obedience. That's the foundation. But if you remember at the very beginning, the Alter Rebbe said, really, you need both. You need two wings. You can't fly with one wing. You need love and fear. We got off on a tangent explaining why we need fear first. But why do we need love and fear?
That's the two wings.
Oh,
You can't fly with
the Alter Rebbe told us that there are two wings, that the emotions, the kavana, are the wings. And if you remember in the last chapter, we discussed that depending on the kavana, that's how high the mitzvah can raise in the spiritual worlds, right? So if you only have fear, the bird isn't going to get too high or too far. Yeah, you need two wings. The right wing corresponds to love, or a feeling of closeness. The left wing corresponds to awe and fear. But why do we need two wings? Why is it that we need two wings? Oh, no, sorry. If this is the case, that we need two wings, why is it enough to focus on one at a time? Focusing on one at a time is not going to get, if you focus on Yira, you're not going to get anywhere because you're still missing a wing. It's not going to accomplish anything. The contrary, you probably want to let the wing rest. If you're going to flap the one wing and it's not working, eventually when you get the other wing working, it's not going to go anywhere because it'll be too tired. So why exercise one wing before you can exercise both?
Like baby steps.
Okay. So in other words, you're training the wing. You do it slowly. It seems like you have to fully embrace Yira, fear, obedience 100%, and then you can work on love. So the Alter Rebbe is going to tell us something very interesting. That really, you need both, of course. But the fact of the matter is, most people have one. By nature, naturally, most people gravitate towards one side, either love or fear. Not most people, all people they're built, we as humans are built or constructed in a way that we possess both qualities. However, we are dominated by one over the other. Usually one is more dominant. So Alter Rebbe is going to tell us that usually people, what speaks to them, what's easier to catch their attention is love. Yeah? What's more difficult? Fear, obedience. We resent that type of feeling. So if you work on your fear, your love already exists. Your ability to connect to God because of how great God is and how kind He is. And again, it may take some meditation, but you don't have to work as hard on that side as you do on the fear side. So if you work on the fear, the love, not too long after that, both wings will be operational, in a sense. Make sense?
Well, aren't you, being Jewish, aren't you sort of inherited the love side of God?
You technically inherited both sides, but yes, we spoke about the hidden love that's an inheritance from Abraham. And usually we are conditioned more in that, we're aligned more with that way of thinking. Again, we love other things more than we love God in a revealed way. Our bodies love having a good time more than it loves God, and therefore it spends more time advancing its own agenda than advancing God's agenda. But if we manage to adopt this fear, or at least this obedience, then it's much easier to take the love and channel it towards that. Because we already have, we resent obedience as humans. Again, not 100% and not always and not all, but generally speaking, most people, vacation means I don't have to do what I'm supposed to do. They wish they could go over the speed limit or not put on their seatbelt or go through the red light in the middle of 3 o'clock in the morning when there's no one around. We're looking to that's perhaps the bigger struggle. Okay, let's look here at the end of 610, bottom of 610. Without any fear at all, however, in other words, one's fulfillment of Torah and mitzvot, does not soar on high to the supernal spherot through love alone, just as a bird cannot fly with one wing. For fear and love are the two wings as stated in Tikkunei Zohar. But where's the love? Similarly, fear alone is but one wing, and one's service cannot ascend with it on high, even though it is termed the service of a servant, duly motivated by awe of fear. In other words, even if you only have fear, you're still considered a servant. But still, it's not two wings that can raise you higher, for there must also be the service characteristic of a son. In other words, service motivated by love, in order to awaken at least the natural love for God that is hidden in one's heart, so that he should at least become conscious of it in his mind, to recall his love of the God, one God in his thought and in his desire to cleave to him. This recollection of his hidden love for God should arouse within him a desire to cleave to him. And this should be his intent when occupying himself with Torah or with a particular commandment he is about to perform. For his divine soul as well as his vivifying soul, in other words, his animal soul, together with their garments shall cleave to him, as has been explained above. Yeah, in other words, you need both. You need both. But the question is, which one do you need to work on first? Which one are you lacking in? Are you missing? And Alter Rebbe tells us most people need to work on fear first.
At some point, they both have to be balanced, don't they?
Yes. We're going to get there. You know, there's a story in the Talmud, again, we've shared the story before, of I believe one of the 10 martyrs that we speak about on Yom Kippur that were killed by the Romans, one of the 10 sages. And he was confronted by his teacher. His crime was teaching Torah. You weren't allowed to teach Torah then. And he was teaching Torah, and his teacher confronted him, asking him, how are you allowed to risk your life to teach Torah? It's not one of the 3 cardinal sins for which you have to give up your life for. So he asked him, let's say I do, will I still merit a place in the world to come? So he says, tell me. Um, we would think for sure. Excuse me. Someone who's risking their life to teach Torah, there can't be a greater person than that. But his teacher asked him, tell me, did you ever do something good? What type of question is that? But he thought about it. Why did he have to think about it? Listen to his response. Yeah, he found something good he did. What did he do? His job was to collect charity on Purim, or also other times, but to collect charity. Now, charity collectors, later the Talmud says you should only collect charity in pairs, so that no one should be tempted to take something. But at the time, he was a loan collector, and he had one pocket was his personal money, and the other pocket is where he kept all the charity's money. And at the end of the day, he was counting money for charity, and there was some money that he wasn't sure if it belonged to him or belonged to charity. And he decided to give the whole thing to charity, all his money to charity, because he wasn't sure. Something got mixed up. He wasn't sure, so he just gave the whole thing to charity. So his teacher heard this and he said, okay, you get a place in the world to come. What's going on over here? I gave an extra few dollars to charity. That gets him a place in the world to come. And teaching Torah in the most dangerous time to preserve the Torah, that doesn't get him a place in the world to come. So Chassidus explains as follows. What type of person gives up their life to teach? I'm not talking about spiritually. What type of person?
Brave type person.
Brave, okay.
Dedicated.
Dedicated, yeah. But what type of personality gives up their life to teach. You would think an intellectual, someone who's an intellectual, not an intellectual person, someone who's a professor, someone who's an academic. Yeah. Most academics, that sounds bad. It's going to sound too, but generally speaking, an academic person is not a giving person of his own money. In other words, they love to give their knowledge, they love to share their knowledge, but they're not going out and giving out charity, handouts. In other words, this rabbi, what would his nature tell him to do? Let's just use, for example, let's say he had $1,000 in charity's pocket, he had $1,000 in his pocket. There was $100 or $200, he wasn't sure if it was charities or not. Yeah. What would his nature tell him? Take $200 and just give it to charity because you don't know. Take the $1,000 and give it to charity? That makes no sense. For this type of person. For the communal leader, for the philanthropist, that's not a big deal. Go and kill yourself to learn Torah, that's a big deal. But for this rabbi, giving the charity, that's a place where he went out of his comfort zone, out of his nature. Giving up his life to teach may not have been a real sacrifice for him, is what the Talmud is telling us. Because that's who he was. That's not a sacrifice. A parent jumps in front of a car to save their child, that's not a sacrifice. That's being a parent. For a stranger to jump in front of a car to save a child, that's sacrifice. Yeah? So here the Alter Rebbe is telling us the same thing. Every person has their niche, the thing that drives them. And then there's the thing that they want to avoid. That's the part we have to nourish. That's the part we have to strengthen. That's the part we have to grow. The Rebbe Rashab, the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, lived in a very tumultuous time in Russia and the Soviet Union. He became the Rebbe at a very young age. His father died before 50. He was only 22 when his father died. For 10 years, he refused to officially become the Rebbe because he had an older brother that lived there. His brother refused to become the Rebbe. He was a businessman. He wanted his younger brother. His younger brother refused to do anything because he had an older brother there. Until after 10 years, his brother realized, I better leave. And his brother moved to a different place, and then he became the Rebbe. But for those 10 years, he was still the de facto, but he refused to sit in his father's, in the Rebbe's place because he had an older brother there. Yeah, and we have a biblical obligation. It says in the Ten Commandments to honor your father, kabed et avicha. There's an extra word there, which doesn't honor your father, not your father. We know who your father is. A person only has one father. What does it mean, the? To add, it says your oldest brother or your older brother. So there was a certain type of respect. Anyhow, but this was in the year 1882, end of 1882, and he passed away in 1920. So he lived in Russia. The end of his life was during the revolution. During the first, right, he had to escape from Lubavitch during the First World War, and then the Bolshevik Revolution. But throughout his leadership, is when the Zionist movement started, political Zionist movement started. Also, it's when, and it was a very secular movement that tried to penetrate into Russia in the guise of connecting with the religious Zionists. That was the way it was being presented. And the Rebbe Rashab wasn't sure what this animal is. Is this something that's really going to benefit the religious community, or is it going to undermine the religious community? A very difficult time in Russia for the Tsar had many, many decrees against the Jewish education. It was a terrible time, a difficult time. The Rebbe Rashab sent one of his Hasidim to go see this. I don't know if it was particularly the Zionist movement. One of these movements, the Rebbe was invited to a meeting of many rabbis. He wanted to see, is it worthwhile going? So this Chassid went to go check out, to figure out if this is something worthwhile attaching to it. He came back and he didn't answer. I don't know exactly what the answer was, but he told the Rebbe Rashab the following story, the following metaphor. There was once a boy that was set up to go out on a date with a girl. And he comes back home and he tells his mother or he tells his parents, no, she's limp. She can't walk. She can't walk properly. One leg is bigger than the other, but I don't care. Also, one hand is shorter than the other. I don't care. She has this issue, that issue. Every issue he brought up, he said he doesn't care. After a while, his mother gets a little impatient. She's like, "What do you mean you don't care? We want you to marry someone that you're worthy, that's worthy of you, so to speak. What do you mean?" He's like, "I don't care because I'm not planning on marrying her." In other words, he was telling the Rebbe Rashab, it doesn't matter what I'm going to tell you about them. It's a waste of time. You have no reason to go there. So any report is beyond. We mentioned, I think, I don't know, last week or 2 weeks, the L'Shem Yichud. We mentioned that. We say it in the morning. In Chabad Siddur, we say it before Baruch Sha'amar in the morning. And many Sfardim or people that follow Kabbalah say it before they do every mitzvah. Some people say it before the counting of the Omer or some other mitzvahs. The phrase is L'Shem Yichud, for the sake of unifying, Kudsha Brichu, loosely translated as the Holy One, blessed be He, Ushchinte, and His Shekhinah. You've heard the term Shekhinah? You know what the word Shekhinah means? Huh? Right. So the presence in a dwelling form. Okay. So his dwelling presence. To unify the name Yud and Hey with the Vav and Hey. Those are the two halves of God's name. And in what context did we address that? Did we bring it up? Remember? What exactly is going on here? What we're saying, there's two parts of God that we have to unify.
Shekhinah is usually the feminine form of Hashem.
Well, the word Shekhinah is feminine, is the feminine. Yeah. But what are the two? God is two. Is one Hashem Echad. What are we trying to unify here? And what are we breaking God's name up into and putting it back together? What does that mean? We're saying that we're unifying, we're connecting the Yud and the Hey, the first half, with the Vav and the Hey. When did they ever break apart?
Well, isn't God's name the combination of was, is, and will be,
Okay,
right?
but that's Haya, Hoveh, and Yiyeh. Okay, but each one of them has Yud and Heys. They all.
But you put them in a certain order, and it spells like that.
No, God's name includes all three because God is above time. God creates time. So God isn't made up of three. He created it. So they're all found within him, but it's not as separate entities. Okay, let's first understand. We said Shekhinah is dwelling, is God's presence in a dwelling form, and Kudsha Brichu, or in Hebrew, Hakadosh Baruch Hu, means the Holy One, blessed be He. What do the words actually mean? Let's remove God for a second from it. Shekhinah. Shekhinah means to dwell. In other words, it's almost like the difference between a house and a home. I can own 5 houses. But where do I dwell? Where is my presence felt? If I own 5 houses, chances are, if you walk in to those 5 homes, you will get a different feeling walking into 4 of them that I don't live in or don't usually live in, and the one I spend most of my time in. Why? Because that's where I live. That's where my presence is felt. That's where I am. The other ones, there's a little distance between me and the home. Yeah, my favorite knives and peelers and computer and toys and towels are going to be in the home I spend 9 months out of the year, not in the homes I spend 3 months out of the year, right? Shechina represents God, the way he decided to come and manifest himself amongst us. What happened by the giving of the Torah that we're celebrating Monday? What does it say in the verse? What happened before when God gave us the Torah? Physically in this world, what happened? Yeah, physically is a difficult word.
Should make a home for me, I
No,
dwell.
not yet. No. You're ahead of your time. You're jumping the gun.
Wrong book.
Wrong book. No, it's later in the book, but it's wrong part. That happened the day after Yom Kippur. What happened the day of the giving of the Torah? It says God came down on the mountain. God came into this world. The Medrash tells us God came back to his garden. God created a world. The world was a garden, and God's presence was in the garden. What happened? Adam and Chava ate from the tree of knowledge. God sort of left this world. There are 7 worlds, it says in Kabbalah, and every great sin that happened in history, God went up another level. Then came Abraham and turned around the tide and brought God down one level. Isaac, another level. Jacob, another level. Levi, Kahas, Amram, Moshe. Moshe was the 7th. Moshe managed to bring God's presence back into this world. And that's why in Shira, Shirman, Song of Songs, it says, Bati ligani achoti kala. I came to my garden, my sister, my bride. And the Medrash says, this God said when he came down at Sinai, I've come back home. I've come back to my home. So what happened in the 2,500 years between the Garden of Eden and the Torah? God was there, God left and came back. Okay, what was the advantage? God could have just stayed the whole, in other words, what do we benefit now? Well, it was supposed to be, now this would be eternal. But because the Jews didn't work for it, it was a gift. What happens when you get a gift? You're not as careful with the gift than if you would have worked for it. And it took only 40 days for the Jews to say, sorry, God, but we don't see you, so we're going to create a golden calf to lead the way. So now God told Moses, he was furious with the Jewish people. He wanted to kill the Jewish people. Moses prayed on their behalf. God should not kill them. But God said, okay, I'll let them, but I cannot walk amongst you. I will send an angel, a messenger to lead you. I can't be with you. Moses wouldn't take that for an answer. So he went up another 40 days and prayed. And on Yom Kippur, God said, I have forgiven as you requested. I will come back and be amongst the Jewish people. But with a caveat. What's the caveat? I will not be in everyone's home. Make for me a mikdash, a dwelling place, v'shachanti bitocham, and I will dwell in this temple. In other words, if you wanted to see God's presence, all you had to do was open your eyes in the 40 days between the giving of the Torah and the golden calf, and you'd see God. After Yom Kippur, God says, you want to see God, you'll have to come to the temple. And during the temple, there were 10 miracles that were open miracles a person could see anytime. Well, some of them you were only able to see certain times, but there were open miracles in the temple that you witnessed God, so to speak, not physically, but you witnessed God in physical manifestation in the temple. That's Shechina. Shechina is, God says, I'm coming to dwell. Now, literally in the verse, it says, I will dwell in the temple. But what's the word that's used? Plural. V'shachanti bitocham. I will dwell amongst them. And the Medrash understands from this that really God's dwelling in each one of us. We can each create a temple. We can each have an altar where we bring sacrifices. Which sacrifices do we bring on our personal altar? Animal sacrifices that we bring on our personal altar. Every day we could. Which animal?
Was that the birds? No?
Which animal can we sacrifice every day? You're learning Tanya, huh? The animal soul.
Oh,
When we bend the animal soul, that's a sacrifice. We're sacrificing our animal soul on the personal altar in our personal temple. That's Shechina. So Shechina is a very intimate, very what does kadosh mean?
It's like it's holy.
Holy. What does it literally mean? Separated. The where you see this term used is in marriage. What's marriage called in Judaism?
Condition.
Kiddushin. Kiddushin is the same word, kadosh, sanctification. But that stage of marriage, there are two stages of marriage. The stage of kiddushin is actually not where husband and wife come together. If a husband and wife only have kiddushin, they're not allowed to live together. That's nisuin or chuppah. Kiddushin historically was done a year before marriage. What's kiddushin? Sanctification, if you will, if it's holy. What is kiddushin? Now you're forbidden to the whole world. You can't marry anyone else. We're not married yet, but I've sanctified you. What does that mean? I've separated. In other words, how is the sanctification expressed? By separating you from the rest of the world. Literally, Kiddushin means separated. We make Kiddush on Shabbos to designate this day different from the previous 6 days, to separate it from the other 6 days. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the way God remains aloof, higher than the world, not within the world. In the terminology of Hasidus that we've had before in Tanya, if you remember, there is the level of Mimalei Kol Almin and Sovev Kol Almin. Remember that? Can you figure out what those words mean? Mimalei Kol Almin? Mimale, malay. What does malay mean?
Full.
Full. Fills the world. Sovev kol almin. Sivuv or saviv. You know what the word saviv means? Around. Surrounds the worlds. In other words, is above and separated from the world. Now, you look at this, you'll know there is no duality in God. God is everywhere. The question is, what does God allow us to experience? Remember, we're wearing the sunglasses. We're wearing those tinted glasses. So we can only observe mimalei kol almin because that's the level, the shechina, the part that dwells within us and amongst us. Sovev kol almin hakadosh stays higher. We can't even fathom. So what happens when we do a mitzvah? We say we are going to now unify. We're going to unite kudsha brichu ushchinte. Shchinte means his shchina. Whose shchina? Kudsha brichu shchina. In other words, the part of God that God wants to be felt within us. By doing a mitzvah, we combine the two together. In other words, we elevate the shchina back to its source, not by removing it from this world. Again, in spirituality, there is no there versus here. It's infinite. It's spiritual. It's not limited by space. But in the current situation I'm in now, in the present state where I can now only see Mimalei Kol Almin, by doing a mitzvah properly with the right kavanah, with the right emotions, I can combine and now remove those shades. I can combine kutshabrichu and shchinte. And that's yud, the yud and the hey, and the vav and the hey. Let's take this. I know we want to get inside, but let's take this a little further in being able to grasp what we're trying to do here. God created man in his image. Now, man, when it says he created Adam in his image, what does it say right after that? How does the verse continue? Zachar unekeva bara otam. He created man in his image, male and female, he created them. In other words, the human that God created in his image was both male and female. So if you're a man, you're not really in God's image. You're only half of God's image. And if you're a woman, you're only half of God's image. So how does a person become fully in God's image? So the verse continues, not in the next verse, the verse continues. A person should leave his mother and father, cleave to his wife, and become one. So the the Zohar tells us that really a person is a half a body. Every human being is a half a person. When God creates a soul, God, it says, when does a person get his match? When does a person get his bashert? It says 40 days before he's born. In other words, 40 days at the moment of conception. Because a child is formed at 40 days. It says within the first 40 days you could pray, a parent could pray for the child to be male or female. After 40 days, already there starts to be formed to the body, and then it's a futile prayer because it's already decided. First, you got 40 days to decide. So 40 days before the child is formed is the moment of conception. The moment of conception, God says, the soul of this person will go to this person. In other words, this will be the husband, this will be the wife. Why at that moment? Because at that moment that God takes the soul, divides it into two, puts the male soul in this body, God doesn't have to say anything. We know who the bashert is, the other half of the soul. So when the husband and wife come together, what do you have? Two halves of a soul coming back together. Yeah. And you have this even in the Hebrew words for man and woman. What's ish? How do you spell ish? Ish. Aleph Yud Shin is ish. Isha is what? You would think Aleph Yud Shin Hey, but it's not. Aleph Yud Shin Hey means her husband, her ish. Isha is Aleph Shin Hey. The Yud makes it male. So so each one has three letters. Aleph Yud Shin, Aleph Shin Hey. Two letters are the same. Which two letters are the same? Aleph and the Shin. You know what Aleph and Shin spell? Aish, what's Aish? Fire. Male and female are fire. What's fire? What's the problem with fire? Fire can be destructive. It could build, it could be destructive. But if you put the Yud in the man's name, the Hey in the woman's name, in other words, when you get married, you introduce God into the marriage. It's not just male and female. There's God there. God's name is present. Now you can have a child. Now this is a marriage that can last. Remove God from the marriage, and what do you have? Fire. You can have a beautiful marriage for some time, and then you can have a destructive marriage. It's fire. Fire you can't really control. No matter how controlled of an environment you put fire in, the Talmud says if the fire gets out and damages someone else's things, you're responsible because you can't really control fire. Obviously, if there's a tornado wind that comes, that's a different thing. But if your fire gets out of control, because chances are fire is out of control. In other words, God took his image and divided it into two, the Yud and the Hey. More generally, the Yud and the Hey and Vav and the Hey. Those are the two parts of God's name. There is a name of God that's just Yud and Hey. But generally speaking, there's the Yud and the Hey and the Vav and the Hey. And God divided it, put it in this world in the form of male and female. And our job is to bring them back together and have a child. Be godlike. That's how we are godlike. We create a child. More generally, God divided his name into two. The Yud and the Hey is God, is the soul. The Vav and the Hey is the world. What do we do? What do we accomplish when we do a mitzvah? When we take a physical object or our physical body and we do something that God wants it to do.
You bring it closer together.
Now we're connecting the two halves of God's name, the Kudsha Bricho and the Shechina. Just like marriage. Marriage is taking two opposites. A man and a woman are two opposites, taking two opposites and bringing them together into one. taking a physical object and uniting that with God's desire, with the most spiritual thing, is a marriage. And that combines the two and therefore completes the circuit. Yeah.
But it could be any male and any female, because otherwise God would already know who you're gonna marry.
God knows who you're going to marry.
But what about somebody who doesn't get married? Then I guess they're never,
But what's your question?
well, I guess God already knows.
Person has free choice. I can choose not to get married. God doesn't force me to get married, right? Fine. But that doesn't mean I don't have half of my soul that's out in the world looking for its other half. Today it's much more difficult to have this conversation today for very practical reasons, because very simple reasons. Many people ask, what about the first marriage, second marriage? There's so many details. Was the first marriage, was it a kosher marriage? Was it a marriage according to Torah? If it wasn't, then maybe it's not the soulmate, right? It wasn't a real marriage. It wasn't the Torah didn't see it as a marriage. And the Torah itself says if a marriage doesn't work out, you divorce and marry someone else. Or if someone passes away, a spouse, you marry someone else. So what's going on here? Do I have three parts to the soul? And what will happen when Mashiach comes? Will I have two wives, two husbands? These are already things beyond the scope of my expertise. But generally speaking, the way Judaism sees it is your first marriage, kosher marriage, is the bashar, is your soulmate, is the second half of your soul. That's generally speaking, and no matter how miserable the marriage is, and it could be miserable, that's your soulmate. That doesn't mean you can't get out of the marriage. The Torah has a prescription for divorce, so you could get out of it. Doesn't mean you should stay in it. An abusive marriage, I'm not saying you should stay in it. That doesn't mean that it's not your soulmate. In other words,
By yourself without.
Exactly. Well, but that's obvious. That's obvious because you're missing half. Correct. We would hope, and we hope and we wish and we work that the introduction of the other half, missing part of our soul, makes us complete and therefore brings us peace. It doesn't always work that way. That's fine. I would venture to say if we had that perspective, we'd put in a lot more effort to make it work, and perhaps it would work more often than it does. But that doesn't mean the Torah has a prescription for divorce. There's no question. And even if we take divorce out of the question, can you not remarry after a spouse dies? You got the same issue. So either way, you got the same. But the Talmud does say, the Torah says that the altar sheds tears for someone who has to marry a second time. And it says one of the things that's difficult for God to do, like the splitting of the sea, is to make matches. The Talmud asks, wait, I thought you told me that God already decides the match 40 days before conception because the two halves of the soul. How is that difficult? Why is it difficult for God to be a matchmaker? And the common understanding is second marriages. Because now God has to take two halves that don't belong together, that weren't, well, I shouldn't say don't belong together, that weren't created as two halves of one, and somehow make them fit. Now, you've got a craftsman that can make that work. They could take two halves of a car and somehow weld it together and make it look beautiful, or take two halves of or today already doctors can take skin and limbs from other bodies and put them and make it look beautiful. But it's very difficult. And it's very costly. And God says it could be done, but it's difficult. It's much more difficult than being born with a proper limb, with everything functioning properly. Okay. Let's look here at the way the Alter Rebbe says it here. Page 613. Yet, in fact, the sages of blessed memory have said that a man should never separate himself from the community. Therefore, he should intend to unite and attach to him, blessed be he, the source of his divine soul, and in addition, the source of the souls of all Israel. This source being the spirit of his mouth, called by the name Shekhinah, because it dwells, shochenet, and clothes itself in all worlds, animating them and giving them existence. And it is the Shekhinah which imbues him with the power of speech to utter his current words of Torah, or with the power of action to perform the particular commandment at hand. So it's the Shekhinah that clothes itself within the person, within the world, Memale Kol Almin. And you are able to, therefore, what was the second paragraph on 613? We said, therefore, he should intend, what should be the kavana to unite and attach the Shekhinah with Hashem himself, right? We're trying to unite Shekhinah and Kudsha Brichu, the Holy One, blessed be He. Right? Let's continue on 614. This union of the source of Jewish souls with God is attained through drawing forth the light of the blessed Ein Sof here below, by being occupied in the Torah and the commandments wherein it. Wherein it, the light of the Ein Sof, is clothed. And he should be intent on drawing his blessed light over the source of his soul and of all souls of all Israel, so as to unite them with him. The meaning of this union will be discussed at length later on. Note there. And this then is the meaning of the words we recite before performing various commandments for the sake of the union of Kudsha Brichu with his Shekhinah in the name of all Israel. Yeah, that's what this prayer means. Okay, we're going to have to leave the note. We'll probably do it, but we'll have to leave it for not next week. We're going to have to take a break for a week because although Wednesday is the day after Shavuos, I believe the kids start school late, which means I won't be back here in time. And I may also have to go bring Levi back home to yeshiva. So